Hello, I'm Pat Harvey in Los Angeles with some big news. The CBS California stations are hosting a debate for the top candidates running for governor. And you can watch it or stream it on CBS stations across California at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, April 28th. And to help you get ready for the debate, CBS California reporter Julie Watts, CBS LA political reporter Tom Waite, and Pomona College political science professor Sara Sadhwani will hold weekly roundtables to provide news and analysis from the campaign trail. It's all part of our commitment at CBS California to help voters decide. Here are Tom, Sara, and Julie with this week's countdown to the governor's debate.
Thanks so much, Pat. Yeah, a lot to talk about once again this week. Just this week, we have Rusty Hicks, the chair of the California Democratic Party, holding a pretty unusual press conference where the Democratic Party for the state released some new poll numbers, and they're pretty consistent with a lot of the other polls that we've seen over the past few weeks that we've talked about here, which is that you've got 2 Republicans in the top 2 spots, and then you have 3 Democrats polling at about 10% each. And remember, with the California primary in June, the top 2 vote getters go on to the November general election. So for Democrats, there's a little bit of panic, maybe a little bit of concern, whatever you want to call it. They are worried for sure because we continue to see the 2 Republican candidates in the race polling pretty high. And I got to say, I watched and was looking at the press conference yesterday with Rusty Hicks, the chair of the Democratic Party. It was almost a bit somber. You can tell there's concern, there's infighting. We've heard Democrats kind of pointing fingers, accusing the Democratic Party of discrimination because the lower polling candidates are candidates of color. And of course, we had the debate this week that was canceled. So, you know, there's a big missed opportunity, I think, in terms of the debate that was canceled. Obviously, Democrats want as much visibility as possible. They want to see if they can break that logjam. And right now, it just seems like it's still locked up with these 3 candidates, Tom Steyer, Eric Swalwell, and Katie Porter, kind of in this neck-and-neck race, trying to break through to that top 2 spot.
You're absolutely right, Tom. It's kind of a fascinating situation because we don't often see a party going out and commissioning these kinds of polls. You know, many folks around the state have really been referring to these as the shame poll, an opportunity for Rusty Hicks to really try and push out some of those candidates who remain on the lower end of the polling. Much to be seen whether or not he'll actually be successful in doing that. I think one of the other interesting things, though, that comes out of this poll is that those top 3 candidates that you mentioned, Swalwell, Porter, and Steyer, they still, all of this time, all of the money that is already being poured into these campaigns haven't really been able to break through. I would have expected that by this time you would have seen one of these candidates begin to pull away, but thus far it doesn't seem like that. And I wonder if that's what's giving some of the folks on the lower end of these polls a little bit of sense that they should stay in and continue to push.
You know, I was talking with some of the folks, well, one candidate in particular who is polling around 2%, and they pointed out, listen, Mamdani in March of last year was polling around 2% heading into the primary, and he is now the New York mayor. So anything can happen. I think it's also important to remember that we've got, you know, depending on the poll, roughly 35% of Californians who are undecided. If any one of those 2%ers gets a good chunk of that, they don't even need the whole thing, suddenly they're number 1. So I think when you're down at the bottom, you still believe, hey, it is anybody's game. I think what's interesting, though, is in speaking with some of the folks working on the Republican campaign, they are convinced that there's no world where there's a top 2 Republican general election. They're not working under that you know, sort of theory at all. But what somebody pointed out to me this week, which I also thought was really interesting just in terms of polling and the general election, is you only need, you know, 5 million and some change votes to win governor. And Donald Trump had more than 6 million votes in the presidential election. So the key is going to be getting turnout. You're going to have a couple of ballot measures, including voter ID, that will likely turn out Republican or more conservative voters. And so I think that, you know, that's also something to think about. While those folks don't think there's a top 2, they still think there's a chance a Republican could win against a Democrat, which I think general consensus is that just doesn't happen in California. But this year, gosh, everything is different, right?
Some interesting things actually coming out of this Democratic poll from the Democratic Party. When you break it down, and they provided the crosstabs for the poll, and you know me as a big nerd, I of course wanted to go in and study them and take a look. Race, of course, has been one of these pieces that has been looming over this this whole governor's race. But when we start to look at Asian American, Black, Latino respondents, interestingly, first of all, amongst Republicans, Bianco's doing very well amongst Latinos and 16% support amongst Latinos. However, Villaraigosa and Becerra actually aren't even breaking 10%. The one candidate who really is, it seems to be pulling away for Latino voters is Tom Steyer, which I thought was a really interesting kind of a development for Latinos. Let's see if they actually go out and vote in large numbers. And if that continues, a lot of the older research would say that having a Latino name on the ballot is a cue for Latino voters to go and just simply check their name. That's clearly not happening, at least at this point in time.
I really wonder, to your point earlier, Sarah, that you've got these top 3 Democrats who, by the way, I want a side note, every single Democrat in this race, and I interviewed them all, name dropped Donald Trump a dozen times at least. I mean, I could put together a montage of just the word Trump from the Democratic candidates that would last 5 minutes, right? So they very much understand that they are running against Trump, and they are hoping that that's what's going to turn out. If they can be the anti-Trump candidate, that's going to turn out folks for them, right? Because of Prop 50, because Californians clearly said that they were supportive of sort of that anti-Trump movement. But that being said, I do wonder, as you've mentioned, they've been in the race for so long, and we haven't seen a lot of movement. Swalwell is breaking out a little bit, but not significantly. Looking at this from your sort of analyst point of view, Sarah, do you think that Swalwell is out far enough? I mean, has he shown that he's the front runner?
Certainly he appears to be the front runner at this point in time, but still that margin between him and the other candidates is not very large. To me, I think California voters, when we look at some of these polls, they're also very much concerned about the state of California and really concerned about the direction the state is going in. It seems that, and rightfully so, that California voters also want to have someone who can fix some of the larger problems that we see in the state around affordability. It's one thing to, as a candidate, talk about affordability, but to have a proven track record, that's not something we're seeing, at least amongst those top 3. Interestingly, you see the more experience and more of that record amongst those who are lower down in the polls.
Yeah, I spoke with Rob Stutzman, who's a Republican campaign consultant and also used to be a deputy chief of staff under former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he was saying, I think quoting him directly, this is the saddest governor's race ever. Because, in his opinion, and he was sort of giddy about it in a way, in that there's just not a lot of name recognition. There's no big stars in this race, at least on the Democratic side. And, if that would have been different, I spoke with Professor Jack Bitney over at Claremont McKenna College, and he said, you don't have Senator Padilla or former Vice President Kamala Harris coming into the race, which would, of course, have changed the landscape of this completely, and probably we'd be looking at very different polls right now. But you have to give also a lot of credit to Republican voters and respondents in these polls and to their 2 candidates, because they have pretty much solidified their support. I mean, I think when the poll was like 16% and 14%, they weren't huge numbers, but they are solid enough that they are keeping them at the top of the pack. Again, lots of undecided voters. And I think, as both of you were saying, I think the big variable here is the fact that it's a June primary, and that is going to throw a lot of people. They don't expect, a lot of people who aren't paying attention and aren't plugged into politics are not thinking of June as a big, milestone in terms of when they need to turn a ballot in.
First of all, it may be, in some people's mind, the saddest governor's race ever. I personally think it is the most exciting, because often we already know who's going to win, and we don't. It literally is anyone's game, and I think a lot of people out there enjoy that. There is no heir apparent. They have to earn your vote. And so I would say it's the most exciting governor's race, at least I've ever been a part of. And secondly, in terms of this top 2 primary, when we say it was supposed to bring out moderate, candidates or give them a chance, I think it's really interesting that we are seeing Tom Steyer polling as high as he is. He has a legitimate chance at being California's next governor. He is not an industry or a political insider. He has never held a political office. Yes, he's run several times unsuccessfully. But again, it just goes back to, it's what makes this race so exciting is anything can happen. And boy, in the back of my mind, I just think, what if one of those 2%ers end up in the top 2?
Tom Steyer, to your point, I mean, he's paid a lot of money for each point in that poll. He's spent more than $80 million or something, which is just completely, far and away, just blows everyone else out of the water in terms of money spent.
Like Arnold Schwarzenegger, he has worked on propositions. That was really the piece that Arnold Schwarzenegger had under his belt politically when he ran for governor, and certainly that added to his name recognition. So you never know.
Obviously, we're holding our debate. We talked about USC canceling theirs this week, but we just want to let our viewers know that we're carefully reviewing which candidates to invite based on polling and fundraising, and it's a very fluid situation. Our goal is, of course, is to have a very fair and respectful discussion. We want to get these candidates on stage. Obviously, we want to hear what they have to say because, at this point, it is so fluid.
Well, more to come. Looking forward to our debate and next week's conversation.
And that's this week's countdown to the governor's debate. Join us next week for a new roundtable. And I'll see you on debate night live from Pomona College and live across California. You can watch it or stream it all on CBS stations or their digital sites at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, April 28th.